we're going to pick this up in a minute, but I do want to talk first about how much social media is driving what's been happening with disinformation rife, protests that look fairly easy to organise, and protesters apparently at times able to give the police the runaround. Joining me is Joe Ondrak, Head of Investigations at the misinformation tracking company Logically. Good evening, Joe. Just give us the backstory to this. Where has this network emerged? People are talking about a post-organisational far right. How's it happened?
So the scene has been set quite a way back with this, but really galvanised during the lockdowns of 2020 and the pandemic. A lot of people found themselves online looking for answers. A lot of normal people, just everyday users, as well as those with ideologies and agendas. Over the years, during lockdown and when the pandemic was the main news story of the time, you found these groups starting to gravitate towards platforms like Telegram from mainstream platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. And on Telegram, what happened is the infrastructure was laid for a lot of protest organisation to take place. So we saw that with anti-lockdown protests. We saw that with the occupation of the ITV news office. We saw that with the attempted citizens' arrests at vaccination stations. And what the far right saw was an opportunity to hijack and leverage this infrastructure from people who were possibly conspiracy theorists, were anti-vax, or just generally scared and concerned given the pandemic, and slowly turn the dial towards anti-migrant rhetoric, towards far-right rhetoric, planting the seeds and using the language of conspiracy theory to bring people on board to make these ideas more palatable to those who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves anti-migrant.
OK, and when it comes, sorry to interrupt, but when it comes to what we're seeing now, how much is social media fanning this, enabling it, if you like?
The protests are very, very easy to organise online, not just in terms of the infrastructure laid down in places like Telegram, but also the ephemeral social media such as TikTok accounts and Instagram stories. The ability to flash up, create a poster for a protest in Canva, stick it online, get people to screenshot it, share it around, and then these networks, these flows of information are able to circulate it quite rapidly.
Can it be tackled then? Is there a way of stopping it?
There is there's certainly ways in which we can try. The tools that we develop here allow us to track it and try to stop it in its path. However, the rapid development of this and making sure we understand the groups who are both vulnerable to being mobilised when they don't necessarily believe these ideas and those who are taking advantage of them is both key as well.
And what are you picking up about planned protests potentially over the next few days? We know the police are talking about it. Have you picked that up as well online?
There are lots of conversations around various protests. Ironically enough, people talking about both masking up, but also not participating in violence. So you've got this strange cognitive dissonance going on there. There are posters being circulated. At last count, I've seen 16 very sincere efforts to organise protests around the country, with probably more on the way as well.
Joe Ondrak, thanks. Let's pick this up with all of you here on the sofa. Coco, does the increasingly online nature of the way we lead our lives make this problem worse, do you think?
Definitely. I think there's lots of different pieces of the puzzle. You know, I've spoken already about how I think, you know, a lot of the problems, you know, foreign interference, misinformation, people with political agendas, and also just big tech giants being held to no account whatsoever when they allow misinformation to thrive and ultimately benefit from it. Those are all factors that I think when you add that to people feeling hard up for money, angry, upset, I think that does become a bit of a problem. So solving the misinformation thing obviously needs to be done, because it's toxic and terrible, and it sticks, it's sticky. People will keep repeating these lies for a long time until they become true. But I don't believe it is the only thing. I don't believe it's just a case of some thugs and misinformation. I think there's more at play. And actually, I would say, Tim, I would argue that the Conservative government and how they've been kind of doffing the cap to some of these hardline right ideas, I think they also have to take responsibility for it. If you say stop the boats...
The protesters, I suppose, are shouting stop the boats. I wonder how you read that.
Well, look, I think the vast majority of the British people, quite rightly, think that while they're the overall, I think Luke will confirm, British people were welcoming of people who come here generally fleeing for their lives from war-torn parts of the world, but people coming in illegally across the English Channel, breaking into the country effectively, that's strongly disapproved of, and so it should be, because they're undermining the public confidence in the immigration system generally. So I have to disagree with Coco on that. It's not hard right rhetoric. Mrs Thatcher, quoting her again in the same programme, but she was very clear in the 1970s, and she broke the National Front of the 1970s, which really were more extreme than almost any fascist organisation we see on Britain's streets today, by taking really clear positions on immigration and community cohesion. And she said, quite rightly, if mainstream parties do not reassure the public that the borders and the streets are under control, they will turn to extreme parties. And that is the job of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And I don't believe they have exceeded their the language of moderation on this issue.
Yeah. No, but I don't think it is helpful to label something like saying stop the boats, which the vast majority, including most Labour voters, most progressive voters, would want to see, to label stop the boats as hard right rhetoric. I think there has been some language from individual politicians. I think Suella Braverman using phrases like invasion were not helpful. But stopping the boats, wanting control over borders, is a mainstream. It's what the public want. It's what they expect. It's their country, and they also want people to follow the rules when it comes to immigration and asylum. We're a generous country. I often say when it comes to things like refugee policy, the British public want control, but they also want compassion as well for those in need. But you've got to have both.
James Cleverly said tonight, James Cleverly saying we cannot let rioting thugs and rioters win.
But sometimes the narrative that's been engaged with, sometimes it's like Britain is painted as though they're like a lovely grandfather who takes in all the waifs and strays because they have out the goodness of their heart and they've all run amok. That's not what happened. There were jobs that needed to be done, and those people were, most of them, legally allowed in to do those jobs, and they deserve to set up lives here and be respected. If there are illegal, I don't know what the numbers are off the top of my head, but you have to accept that the conflation between legal and illegal has gotten outrageous, and I don't think the Conservative Party wanted to even stop that. People don't know the difference between sometimes a person of colour and anyone else,
But what I think is the danger of what you're tiptoeing towards, I don't think you've quite got there, but is that, like, a lot of people feel that an immigrant should speak English. They should integrate with the rest of it. And they think they should accept basic British values. And there is a sense, I think, out there that if you start to voice those sort of views, it's very quickly you could be shouted down as racist or whatever. And I think having quite a censorious attitude to the certain words that people sometimes clumsily, but not malevolently try to use, means that this conversation is driven underground in a way which sort of leads to the sort of violence we've seen in the streets, rather than it being a serious about our civilization.
I do just want to bring in Lord Wolney, the government's advisor on political violence and disruption. Lord Wolney, thanks for coming on Newsnight. Over the last couple of days, we've seen protests, violence in various parts of England. It's continuing. What's your reaction to it? Does it surprise you?
I think the speed and the volatility with which this has spread has been surprising, and it's certainly seen police forces scrambling to keep up. But I think this has been a latent possibility through the ways in which the far right and extreme actors have been able to organise in recent years.
Do you see it as a resurgence of the far right? Sorry to interrupt.
Well, on the one hand, you've seemed to have the far right at a low ebb, certainly organisationally, but it has been clear that there has been that latent possibility for groups and movements to form quite quickly, aided through the powers and the ways in which social media works, for things to flare up like this. I do think at the moment we are in danger of disappearing down a rabbit hole with these conversations about, is this about because we've had too much conversation about immigration or too little conversation about immigration? You've got a situation on the streets now where a number of towns are running out of control in the evenings, and the focus has got to be on restoring that deterrent effect as quickly as possible.
And how do you do
enabling
that?
the
What can be done? Do you think Keir Starmer's talking about establishing a violent disorder unit and better police force coordination? Is that the answer?
So one of the recommendations of my review was, I think, one of the things which this new unit seems to want to tackle, which is the gap in being able to share intelligence between if you've got troublemakers in one part of the country being dealt with by one force, but they are looking towards organising something in a different part of the country, then sometimes there has been a gap. So yes, getting that capability fired up as quickly as possible, but then we've got relatively new strengthened legislation on the statute book now that enables people who are known violent offenders or have been convicted of highly disruptive or illegal protest in the past to be able to travel to the scene of different sites.
Right.
And
I mean,
that has got to be, I think, used to the maximum now to be able to ensure that you can't have this kind of flying picket of far-right organisers going from area to area and whipping this up wherever they go.
OK, what about the idea of banning them? You know, we know groups like National Action are prescribed. Should the groups involved in this go onto that sort of list and be banned?
Well, I think prescription has had its place, and there's a particular issue over whether it would be effective or not to ban the EDL, given that they formally have been disbanded, but clearly are still apparent in some organisational ways. So yes, I think we should look at that urgently, but it's only ever going to be part of the picture, given actually you're going to have the same ringleaders. The same people who can be active and are able at very quick notice now to build up these fluid, unofficial groupings. I mean, it can take a matter of hours. You can create a new Telegram channel and be able to organise through that. So I think us being at the forefront of what we can do in terms of clamping down on criminal incitement and organising on social media is something we also urgently need to look at, including the way that hostile states have been able to ramp this up systematically. There is a real need to be able to go after that capability urgently and have more resource to be able to shut it down.
Lord Wolney, thank you so much. Let's come back to Tim Montgomery, Coco Khan and the UK Director of More in Common, Luke Trill. He was talking about hostile states' involvement. Luke, any insights into that?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to know. There are people far more qualified than me to talk about that, but it does seem to be this sort of recurring pattern and recurring suggestion that there are hostile actors who want to weaponise events and moments like this, and I think we've got to be aware and alive to it. And I think, it is one of the new fronts of, international conflict now, actually, is the spread of disinformation, misinformation designed to disrupt states.
And Lord Wolney was talking there about potentially prescribing these organisations. Do you think cracking down hard is the answer?
I think, yes, it is. I'm open to any sort of law enforcement measure that deals with these thugs. They cannot be the representative of any community in Britain. And, the very fact that you have British Muslims, huge contributors to our society, not all members of society, but that most British Muslims are good people. The fact that they are frightened tonight because of these jobs, we need the full force of law and order to crack down on these. And I would support pretty authoritarian, even draconian measures to ensure that those communities feel safe.